Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annie. That was stunning. That was absolutely beautiful.
Thanks so much.
Just a couple of questions to get started, and a really basic one. How did you come to your current practice? This is really, really unique. Can you describe how you came to this practice?
Well, I used to have a traditional musical background. Well, I used to have. I used to play in several bands around town.
Yeah.
More of a conventional guitar, bass, keyboard, etc. I've always been interested in electronic music. I've always had interest in synthesizers. And around 2016, one of the bands I was in, the last band I was in, was basically dissolving. And I decided to take a solo route and experiment with some things that I'd been meaning to look at for several years. And I discovered no input mixing for the first time, and was quite fascinated with the results and potential for just using audio feedback to generate sounds.
Can you tell us a bit more about no input mixing? It's something that I know when I was researching before we made contact. One of the things that really caught my eye is this no input mixing, and you think of it, almost intrinsically, the whole idea of a mixer is to take various inputs from somewhere and put them together. Can you tell us exactly what no input mixing is?
Sure. Essentially, it technically is not no input, but the mixer is. Essentially, you can do it with one or two mixers. If you take the output of a mixer and plug it into the input of another mixer and vice versa, you're essentially creating a feedback loop with the components of the mixer itself. It's essentially a rather unstable and chaotic oscillator. And so you can create some interesting sounds that many would consider noise. But there's always just the components of any electronic device, they're never perfectly silent. So if you plug the feedback, the input into the output, at some point you're going to get an oscillator, essentially.
And can you manipulate that oscillator? I mean, other than, say, for example, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment, putting effects in the in between the input and the output, the internal input and output. Are there ways that you can control that de facto oscillator?
Yes. So by using the various controllers controls on a mixer, various faders. Volume controls, effect sends, that will vary the sounds that you can get as a result. So it's quite frequently you don't get the same thing twice, which is one of the appealing things to it. You may get a particular style of sound you may be able to replicate, but very rarely can you get exactly the same thing two times just due to the nature of the instability of the system.
You actually completely anticipated the next question that I was going to ask, because it seems to me like you're saying that that oscillators like this are going to be really unpredictable. And I can imagine, certainly in improvised music, one of my favorite things about it is that unpredictability. Is that something that you find that is one of the things that actually attracts you to this practice, in that regardless of how much prep you do beforehand, it's never exactly going to be the same?
Yeah, precisely. One of the things I discovered while taking on this practice is I essentially like to look for sounds I've never heard before. So you never know exactly what you're going to get. Honestly, what I just did, I'm quite surprised and pleased with the results. I had a direction to go in and some ideas, but essentially you're pushing a boulder, and once it gets rolling, you kind of have to steer it in directions that you feel suit the moment.
Right. Now I'm thinking that's fantastic. I love that idea. Now I'm thinking, like you were saying, that we have the sort of the internal kind of mixing, the no mix, or what am I saying? My no input mixing, and in between when you're patching internally. What do you use or do you use anything to alter that signal, and does that give you another degree of control and also potentially chaos?
Yes, you can put anything in a signal path to adjust it as you see fit. Different things will have different results. Again, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen until you try it.
Right.
Which is part of the joy of the experimentation. So you strictly can take, and some people do, just a a mixer or two and patch them into each other, and then take that raw output, and that is the result. It can be extremely harsh, very high pitch.
Yes.
Very, very. You can get very repetitive drum-like sounds, a lot of popping, etc. But anything you can do to the signal, and it does actually, on a similar note, apply to video as well in a similar practice. There's a video equivalent, which is some of what I did do just then, which is essentially internal mixer feedback.
That's amazing. I was going to ask you about that too, because they seem to actually mesh wonderfully. Before we move on to questions around video, can I ask you specifically in that last piece what you were using in that chain in terms of the ways that you were altering the sounds?
The basic the program that I use, essentially the core of most of my work these days, is a program called Sunvox. It is essentially a modular synth program based around a tracker-style sequencer, similar to the Amiga trackers from the 1980s. And it's a very, very featured program with it's very in-depth. I found the first time I saw it, I didn't think that, just from looking at it, that it could do that much, but if you scratch the surface, it's very featured. And that's what I use to process the sounds that I'm doing. In this case, I have, which is basically a circuit-bent nature sounds machine. And I was using a patch in Sunvox essentially as a looping system.
Right.
So I have 8 separate samplers. And I also have a pedal feedback system with a passive matrix mixer, which essentially uses the same principles as no input mixing. And I was using that to generate tones and then process them through Sunvox. And that's one example of how I use this program. It can play samples back. It can be used as a regular modular synth. Many people use it to make chip tunes, like video game music. But it's very featured.
Amazing. Another thing I was going to ask you about is, and this is really on the sonic side of things again, is I'm hearing kind of filtering sounds going on in places like where you might introduce a figure or a motif. And it changes over time, and you're actually altering that with filtering. Are you using the mixer to do that, or are you using things that are patched in between the input?
That's all Sunvox. That's all in the program.
Okay.
So essentially, it does have your basic modular synth features. So it does have filters, filter banks, oscillators, tone controls, samplers, etc. That's all done in the program. I use a MIDI controller. You can map it to any feature in the program itself. That being said, some of the effects I was doing with the pedals were from the pedals themselves.
Were from the pedals. Okay.
Yeah. So there is there's quite a nice EQ on this the metal zone pedal. It's one of the
a metal zone pedal. Did I hear you right?
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
It's renowned. It's not popular amongst guitarists apparently. So it's one of the hated pedals apparently, but it's got a nice EQ and it sweeps very nicely. So it works well in this system, but the bulk of the effects again are in the program itself.
Amazing. Can we hear another piece?
Sure.
Hear and see another piece.
Yeah. Let me just cue something up here.
Great. Thank you.
Just take a moment.
Great, thank you once again.
Thanks so much.
If I could ask, what are some of your influences, not only sonically, but musically? And I'm thinking, I guess we could look at these as being discrete things, but we could also look at them as being integrated as well. What are some of your influences? Could you
A wide range. I grew up with listening to a lot of wide variety of Western pop music and rock, jazz, classical. Listened to a lot of Pink Floyd when I was very young. So it's quite, as I said, quite a wide range. I really, as I said, I like to explore sounds. I tend not to like to pigeonhole music genres in general because I find it's very difficult to describe what exactly I might like. But yeah, a lot of stuff I listened to when I was younger is, I said, Pink Floyd, Kate Bush, King Crimson, J.S. Bach. That's all over the place. I'm a big fan of jazz organ. When I'm not doing this, I'm practicing playing left-hand bass on a Hammond organ. So it's quite a wide range, and I essentially am quite open to just about anything.
I'm thinking it's almost as if you've looked at a good part of my record collection at home somehow. Of course, you mentioned Pink Floyd, and people tend to think of Pink Floyd as being a huge stadium arena rock band. But of course, the visuals are a huge part of what they did, frankly, from their inception. In fact, in the early days of Pink Floyd, when they were performing at clubs like the UFO Club, or some people say UFO, but they would have pronounced it UFO, in the late 1960s, a big part of what they did was, in fact, a projection show. Is that something that you were aware of when you were younger and thought maybe that you would, in your own practice, re-envision that, or was it something that's kind of a coincidence?
It kind of worked out the other way around. I was aware of their shows. I'd never. I was familiar with a lot of the liquid light shows, things like that, were done with overhead projectors, etc. I kind of found or got into the video aspect with the music after I had played with the audio feedback. A few decades earlier, I had seen and experimented with video feedback, basically pointing a camera at a screen. And at that time, I considered that it might be a good mix, given the notion of the audio feedback versus with the video feedback. And so I started doing them together, and so discovered that it's widely done around the world, and there's quite a big community of people doing this kind of stuff. So it was an interesting kind of backwards way to get into it.
It's also a lot less messy than some of those older projection practices, which is waters and oils and colors and all that sort of thing too. That's amazing. You kind of answered this already, but I feel compelled to answer, or to ask you this question in any case, because I think it's always something that that people think about in a deep way. So what I was going to ask you is, how do you situate your work with regard to other genres or fields? And I'm thinking like, classical or art music, or the myriad of popular electronic genres, both mainstream and instrumental. Is that something that shapes what you do? Has it shaped, or is it something that doesn't really factor so much into what you're doing?
It doesn't. Again, it doesn't particularly factor into it. Some of it's when people ask what kind of music I make, I do find it somewhat difficult to describe because there are some vague, general categories, ambient, drone, etc. So I honestly, in this phase of my music making, this is probably the first time in my life I actually went ahead and just started making sounds that I found interesting without any consideration of what might be thought of them. So I'm essentially making sounds for fun, and it turns out that it kind of fits into certain categories that people do enjoy. So that's a bonus. So.
No, absolutely. And I'm thinking actually some of the sounds made by very, very different sources that you're using. And frankly, often I'm thinking going back to the early days of electronic music, with sources that literally would be using valve computers that took up a space about the size of this stage. That some of the sounds that you're making remind me of some of those sounds, not only from the early days of electronic music, but really even through to more contemporary performers and creators. I mean, many of whom have been influenced by people like Brian Eno. Did Brian Eno factor into your creative work at all, or influence?
Yeah, indirectly. Again, Brian Eno, David Bowie, a lot of stuff that I was hearing at the time. A lot of things that I again did not realize till after the fact had been influences. Listening to, especially a lot of just things like the television soundtracks and theme songs from the 70s and 80s. Until you listen back to them, I didn't realize how much electronic sounds were in them. There's a lot of synthesizers, very synthesizer-heavy stuff. And movie soundtracks as well, Tron, Wendy Carlos. Things that just kind of seeped in, and it kind of just flows through once you're processing it.
It's amazing when you're in the moment watching shows like that, you don't really think of it, but you're absolutely right. When you go back, it's ubiquitous. It's just everywhere. Now, we've been talking mostly about the sonic side of your practice. Can you, kind of as we did with your sound sources and the way you're using unusual sources and so on, can you tell us about how you are I guess, curating and manipulating your visual sources, and maybe speak a little bit not only to the sources but also to the technology?
Sure. Again, and something I haven't mentioned yet. One of the fundamental kind of ethos of a lot of what I do is I try to use very frugal methods in what I do. All of the gear in front of me, I can't think of anything here that I might have paid more than $50 for. So, I mean, and I don't tend not to purchase stuff new when I can. I have a background in electronics repair. It's my post-secondary education. So frequently I will buy something or find something that is broken and repair it, or scour thrift stores, etc. In the video side, essentially I have a small video mixer. It's like a prosumer model from probably the 90s. And I'm running a media player with some footage on it through that. And this little box on top is it's known as a dirty mixer. If you take two video signals and attempt to just smash them together, the complexity of the video signal is such that they don't stay synchronized. So that's where you get a lot of the scrolling and so forth in the screen. That can be tamed with this other mixer. And that's basically it, with the addition of the camera feedback. So if you point a camera at a screen, you get kind of the tunnel effect. It was popularly known in the original Doctor Who openings, we're using that effect. And this particular camera is not the one I planned to use, but it's the one that works for this tonight. A lot of the cameras I use are older tube cameras from the early 80s, late 70s. They have a characteristic image that is different than a lot of newer cameras, but essentially any camera will work if you fiddle with it enough. But basically what I'm doing is playing video footage and mixing that in, keying it in like a weather green screen effect with other video sources. This is a fairly simple setup for me, considering some of the other things I may make.
Now, with the audio, you had multiple sources, and we didn't really talk about this, but you're actually using like actual tape loops, right?
In this setup, I'm not using a tape loop. I do. In other cases, I will, but I will have I will slice a tape, record it, and sample it or into Sunvox or use other methods. This the circuit bent Nature Sounds machine. I have installed a lo-fi looper inside of it as well. So there's a small, basically a Christmas ornament voice recorder. It's very, very lo-fi, very, very bad quality audio, but you can downsample some stuff on it and adjust the pitch. And some of the later the tones that I was getting in that piece were using the room sound being resampled into this and then sampled back into the Sunvox program.
That is very cool. Now, what I was leading up to with that question regarding tape is you're using multiple sources on the audio side. How many sources are you using on the video side today for today's presentation? And in other presentations, how many have you used?
Sure. So in this case today, it's there's video footage from the media player, the video camera itself, and I also have the video mixer is patched into itself for a video no input loop. And that if you depending on the mixer, they're all different. It will get different visual effects. Most of the green sliding to the left comes from that in this situation. Normally, or in other cases, I may have a video switcher with multiple input sources, multiple cameras. If I'm doing visuals for another artist, I may have a camera on the screen and a camera on the artist, the performer as well. And you can use just about anything. It's got a video out to get some source in. I've also used like security camera quad splitters. You get four images at once. If you use that with feedback, you get an endless tunnel of 4 pictures going to oblivion. So
the same kinds of unpredictability that happen on the audio side can happen on the video side as well.
Yes, absolutely. And in most cases, generally I am manipulating the camera controls as well. In a case where I'm doing my own sound and video, it's very difficult to do them both at the same time. So I was getting a fixed effect going on. But if you rotate the camera, you can get various spiral effects, very fractal images, and it can be quite complex when you work into it.
No, it's amazing. I think just it's almost like the balancing rotating plates or something. It's amazing that that no, it really is, and it's amazing that you end up with these just beautiful and to me it will look like very purposeful combinations of audio and visuals. It's really stunning. Now I was going to ask you. I don't know about you folks, but I found that the visual side of this is really painterly. It really is. There's a spot where I could think that it's almost evoking something like mid-century abstract expressionism, for example. Has the world of visual art in any informal or formal way shape the kinds of images maybe that you choose and also the ways that you manipulate them?
It's more of the I like to find what any given device or item or piece of gear is good for, like a specific quality that may not be achievable by other methods. A lot of what the results are in the images and the sounds as well are just a result of experimenting with what things can do. I don't discount anything for, if somebody says X pedal, for example, is no good. Or whatever piece of camera gear, et cetera, is not considered a quality item. I will look for something that thing can do, and that speaks to more as to what the results can be.
And I love that in that it's the idea, like some of my favorite artists are those that really use sound sources in an unusual way, or might use an amplifier that on its own, or a pickup combination or something, is actually an unpleasant sound. But in context, it to me it's almost like the way painters use texture and color and so on, that they all don't have to be quote unquote beautiful, in that there are many ways that you can use these unusual sound sources to great effect. And I love that you're doing it there. And I've got to say, I think that the Boss Metal Zone is much maligned.
Oh, yes.
I really do. Guitarists, am I right? Or at least there's one. Okay, there's a few. Great. Great. Do we have any questions from the group here today? And I wonder, Mike, if we could have a handheld microphone, if we have questions from the audience today. Laura, and maybe we'll just wait 1 second until we get a mic. I know I really put them on the spot. I can see someone running up there until we get sorted. Maybe what I'll do before we get to questions from the audience, maybe I can ask a couple or just one more question. I'm thinking in terms of the way that you work up your pieces. Does the visual and musical, do they inspire one another? And is there something like pre-production for your works, or is it basically these are the kind of tools that I'm going to use today, and they're going to have certain opportunities and also limitations, and with them, that might be the effect that I'm going to get?
It can vary. I did find at a certain point, I couldn't really, if I was releasing an audio track, I can't do it without an associated visual track as well. So that's why I end up usually putting a lot of stuff on YouTube. So I have videos to accompany the sounds. When I'm putting something together, as I alluded to earlier, it may be dealing with a feature or a sound. Sometimes I might just start with just a single oscillator in the program, or again, determining what something can do and expanding from there. So there's not any particular pre-production per se. Once I have a process in mind or a concept, essentially I just poke at it until it sounds good. So it's the short answer, but so the planning, it kind of how the gear takes you is the way I look at it in most cases.
So I'm thinking at your house when you're sort of poking around with the gear that you have, your neighbors must be thinking, I live in one of the most interesting neighborhoods in the city.
I tend to keep the windows closed, honestly, I tend to use headphones these days.
But, right.
But also in regards to limitations, I used to do a lot more traditional recording with either 4-track or a Cubase, etc., something with multiple tracks. The computer I used up until about 2016 died. The motherboard capacitors just blew up apparently, and so I didn't end up using a traditional DAW for some time. I was using essentially again Sunvox. A lot of actually all of the recordings that I do these days, everything is built up and performed in real time and recorded to 2-track Zoom recorder. Don't do any post-production apart from maybe cutting, fade in, fade out. But everything is basically done live and recorded straight to the final. So it's all done at once. I have since got another computer and I think another version of Cubase. First time I loaded it up, I looked at it, and it was just completely foreign to me. I couldn't work that way.
That's amazing. And
using multiple tracks anymore. It was basically I build it up, I do it, I practice it, and then just record it right to the final, and I trim the ends off.
That is amazing, and I'm thinking, especially the complexity of the textures that you're building up, that it's happening like that. Now, can we loop back maybe a little bit to the idea of synthesizers and other equipment? One of the questions that I had was, is the idea of well, I was going to ask, why not instruments that, like, say, why not use a full-fledged synthesizer or like a hardware synth or maybe a software synth? And I wonder if the idea of limitations has anything to do with that. Because speaking again of DAWs, I know in my own creative work that I've done, that in a way, one of the biggest enemies of having something completed are options.
Yeah,
and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Again, opening up Cubase and seeing, the first time I think I did was like, I have 64 tracks to fill, and the mindset is I have to fill 64 tracks.
Yes.
And it's like, no, just do what you need to do. I wouldn't say it's misleading. I do use some conventional devices and sounds. I mean, the Sunbox itself is a fully functional featured synthesizer program. A lot of the oscillator tones that you heard in that last piece are generated from somewhat conventional oscillators. They may be, again, it's a modular synth program, so you can modulate or adjust things in surprising new ways. One of the sounds coming from that last piece was using a fairly new function in the program. It's a pitch detector, but then driving another oscillator. So that's where the sounds, the tones were jumping back and forth based on the interaction of another pair of oscillators that were being modulated by each other. I do have a small collection of synthesizers, traditional keyboard synthesizers. I do find the interface of any particular piece of gear affects the outcome.
Absolutely.
So being a keyboard-centric instrument, and I do have a background playing keyboards, that limitation I find a bit limiting. So
yeah.
I've had more success and fun in recent years with free-running oscillators, whether it be a feedback system or in the program.
Yeah, it's amazing. And what makes me think is this actually, in an interesting way, is actually the way a lot of early electronic music started. Was literally oscillators on radios.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn things over now, if we could, to Laura, who's been very patient over here. Maybe Rebecca, we could get the mic to Laura right over here. Yeah. Great, thanks.
Is this on? Okay, I have two questions. First one is, so it looks like your video system and your audio system are like two separate entities, if you will. Have you ever tried like combining the signals? Like I'm thinking about a video synthesizer like the IZ from Kudungatari. Like have you ever experimented with using audio input to generate images?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. This particular mixer doesn't have any audio capabilities. It has an audio mixer, but it doesn't relate to the video. I do have some other gear that does have audio reactive inputs. I tend not to do them. I tend to, again, I rarely do my own visuals, this complexity with my music at the same time. If I'm doing visuals that are involving more gear, I will have more gear. I'm doing it for somebody else. That being said, I do. I have an installation coming up next week at Radio Hull, which is a standalone audio-visual system where the audio affects the video and the video affects the audio. And that is a system where I'm actually using the video signal itself, the tones of the video signal, which is it's quite a wide bandwidth. It's in the megahertz, but the audible section is mostly around 60 hertz, so it's a big buzz sound. And that is being used to drive another patch in Sunvox, which is in turn being used to drive some of the images on a different mixer. So I tend not to do that, but I have the capabilities, and I'm doing it again for the specific instance.
That's really cool.
Thank you.
My second question is, it pertains the rhythm. So I'm assuming a lot of the bass rhythms are formed from the beating of the pulses. So is rhythm something that you consider as you are performing, or do you kind of just let them flow?
It can vary in some of the pieces I've done today, especially the first piece with the looping, the samples. It's a rudimentary looper, so the tones I was sampling in were not being played immediately after I stopped sampling in a conventional looper system. they would trigger once the sequencer went back to the start again. So any rhythms that occurred in that were based on the quality of, or the features, let's say the nature of the sample itself, and the timing is when the sequencer restarted. That being said, again, sometimes it can be just the beating of two particular oscillators or two particular sounds, and what may come up may come up. Again, the last piece I rarely do this, but this was a piece I put together for a recent show where the headliner was a drummer, and I did use a drum synthesizer in it. So there were some drum samples being triggered by some other sounds. Those rhythms were being triggered by basically what you're saying, the beating of several oscillators coming together. So I wouldn't know necessarily what was coming out, but I could adjust it on the fly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Great questions, by the way. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, great.
Your pieces, they kind of like put me in the mind of those scenes in movies where they're in like these steamy hallways and the lights are blaring and alarms are going off. So like, have you ever like thought, like when you finish your pieces and you save them and that kind of thing, that you really like them and you want to like submit them to cinematics and that kind of thing? So
I've not thought that specifically. I do have an interest in film. I haven't actually put anything together. So I mean, the concept of video and video making is something that I am interested in, but not specifically like that. But again, some of the work that I've got online, they don't. There's not particularly an intended narrative, but there's an effect or feeling that is resultant of the visuals. But that's a good idea. I probably should.
yeah.
So,
But yeah, thanks so much. It was very cool. So.
great, thank you.
And questions? I can't quite see from here. Way in the back, yeah.
Yeah, I really agree with this person. Like, especially the first piece, it just reminded me of like these, I don't know, these horror, like these murder movies where like you're in like a dark hall and like there's like this anticipation coming. There's like, you're just waiting for something like huge to happen. Like, I don't know, I could just picture like a character in a room, like, especially like in a dark room that's like alone and scared and like just trying to hide from something that's like gonna come eat them or something. Like, I was just wondering, like, maybe like they'd use this for like a horror movie. I wonder, do they hire these types of people?
People do make sounds.
I believe those type of people would be Annie.
Well, no one's asked me yet, but if I had to work up a good story, I could probably put something together. But a lot of, essentially the dissonance available with a lot of the chaotic sounds tends to lean that way. So depending on how I feel, I will use more dissonance or harmony. And it in a case like this, it was a little on the nightmarish side, but so.
Great. And any other questions? I think you might need to be my eyes, Rebecca, because I really can't quite see it.
I'm here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hi. I think I have two questions, but wait, I'll have the second question if you're able to answer this first one. But I was just wondering if, like, in terms of your guitar pedals, if the metal is a metal zone? I forget.
It's a Metal Zone MT2.
Yeah. If that's the kind of the extent of your signal chain, I guess, like your FX chain.
I have three pedals here. I've got a Boss DD5 delay, the MT2 Metal Zone, and a Sanox 8-stage phaser. When I think the only time I've tried to look it up online, and the only references that I found are ones that I've posted myself. And this one I got it probably sometime in the 90s at the Songbird Garage Sale, now Spaceman Music. And it was probably, I think it was $2 not working, and I don't know if I fixed it properly. So it makes sounds and makes interesting sounds. Awesome. And they're all going through this 3x3 passive matrix mixer.
Okay. And for the second question, I was going to say now that you, like, so since you have like a kind of like more of a bigger single string, I should say, I know with guitars at least, when it comes to having a certain like chain, there's always that kind of like you always want to make sure you have like a distortion first into like more into time space kind of stuff. I was wondering if like for your setup over here with like the feedback stuff, if you would follow that same kind of convention, and I guess the kind of add on to that, if there's any combinations that you found that you kind of like.
Well, two things. With the matrix mixer, again, because it's a passive system, it's basically a box with 9 pots, 9 resistors, and 6 jacks. So everything is kind of connected to everything at the same time. So there isn't necessarily a linear flow, signal flow.
I see.
It's not advised to do this. But it does not won't damage anything. It's that you cannot necessarily get consistent results. So it's not a conventional signal flow as one would use necessarily with a guitar. But the thing about that is I still have further effects downstream in the program. So I do have reverb and various delays on top of what I have here. So it's not the same exactly as you would consider with a straight through front to back system with a guitar. But again, that's part of the nature of the matrix mixer.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think we might have time for one more question. Do we have any more questions? Yep.
Hello.
Hello.
So you were talking a lot about how some things, or quite a few things, are left to chance. And my question is, how much is purely in your control?
Good question. Usually I'll have a concept, or I will have a feeling of what sounds will go where. It's kind of difficult to explain. I have full control, obviously, over volume, every parameter on every effect, every module. So I might know where I'm going to start with a sound and the direction where I want it to go, and that is updated on the fly. So a lot of it, a ton of it is in control. Sometimes, and one of the hardest things to do is to step back and let things evolve, because you always want to just go and tweak something. But it's often best just to let something flow, and it might take, it feels like an eternity where you're not touching something. But given the nature of some of the feedback loops and effects, and I also use some generative patches sometimes where I have no idea what's going to happen. I might have an idea of the flavor that's going to occur, but I don't know the exact sounds that are going to occur. You want to just let them go before you change something, because you never know what you're going to get.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. So I wonder if we could conclude with maybe a final piece of just a few minutes long.
Sure, I can fire something up for you.
That would be great. Thank you, Annie. Great. Thanks to those in the audience here today in KMT, to those watching on YouTube. Many thanks, as always, to the fantastic Q's team who helps us put on such incredible events. And finally, a huge hand to Annie Socoria. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Woo!
Thank you, John.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.